Well, I just gave a lecture that you can find online. It was just a few days ago, March 31st, 2023, on the rise of neo-fascism, not least in the United States of America. And I think that that's something that should concern us all, not least because it's been accompanied by similar trends in Italy with the election of the neo-fascist Prime Minister Meloni, with what might be the impending ascension to power in Vienna of the Freedom Party, the continued strength of the ultra-rightist Alternative for Germany party. I mean, I could go on in this vein. And so there's a very discernible trend. And what helps to complicate our ability to fight back against this trend is that many of our histories that should guide us with regard to the present and the future are seriously askew. That is to say, many of our histories and our historians, they don't even grapple with the question of indigenous dispossession. I mean, it's like indigenous people don't exist, even though that's obviously fraudulent and racist, if not worse. And so, because they don't have an accurate analysis of the past, an accurate analysis that would discuss settler colonialism, this process that, as you know, not only helps to describe what's befallen the indigenous of Australia, the indigenous of New Zealand and Canada, historic Palestine, what once befell the indigenous of Southern Africa, but somehow that descriptor is not necessarily used in our classrooms. And we also know that one of the reasons is that when you do try to tell an accurate story about the bloody, often genocidal past of this country, you run into a roadblock in the form of what's happening in Florida right now with Governor DeSantis, with regard to seeking to circumscribe the teaching of African American studies, or with regard to the 45th US president, who may become the 47th US president, speaking of Mr. Trump, who, in the wake of the initiation of the 1619 project of Howard University's Nicole Hannah Jones, he inaugurated a 1776 commission that repeated the dreary misreadings and lies, quite frankly, that have often characterized the story of how this country was built. And so, because we oftentimes are denied an accurate rendering of how we got to this point, it leaves many befuddled and baffled as to why we are discussing neo-fascism. And it's not just me. Recall that the 46th US president raised the same point a few months ago. And the late Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, one of her last books was Fascism: A Warning. And so I'm sure that many who endured a typical US education are now scratching their heads and stroking their chins, trying to figure out, well, if this is such a great country that built this vaunted constitution and a sturdy democratic republic, why is it that we may be on the verge of fascism? So that is what concerns me as we speak.
A quick question, actually, before getting to your latest books. When you talk about fascism or no fascism, how do you define, like, do you see it as an authoritarian state that has like a one-party system? Is it defined by ethnocentrism, racism? How do you see that?
It's like capitalism from which fascism grows. The capitalism that exists in the United States of America is not exactly the same as the capitalism that exists in Scandinavia. It's not even necessarily the same as the capitalism that exists in Canada, where you have a single payer healthcare system. As a matter of fact, Canada, in many ways, is closer to the social democratic capitalist regimes of Northern Europe than it is to its closest neighbor. I think that there is the traditional interpretation of fascism. And by the way, as I said, I discussed this in the lecture that you can easily find online that I gave a few days ago at the University of Houston. And I begin by recalling the traditional interpretation of the Bulgarian patriot Georgy Dimitrov, who faced off against the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s, who described fascism as the reactionary rule, the terroristic rule of the most reactionary sector of the capitalist class. Now, in the United States, in the current issue of the journal, The New Republic, there is an article by the Seattle intellectual Daniel Bessner, who's reviewing a book by Bruce Kulick, Kulick, on the arrival of fascism as a concept on these shores. And like many, Mr. Bessner feels that the traditional interpretation, the traditional definition of fascism is in a posit, that it does not capture what is unfolding in the United States of America. Fair enough. Come up with a definition that describes what will happen if this country turns in that ominous direction. I think you'll see an acceleration of certain trends, acceleration of police terror, acceleration of occupants of death row, more electoral shenanigans, political assassinations along the lines of what befell Japan and Germany in the 1930s. And as I also say in this lecture that I'm pointing your audience to, what's happened in the United States is that for the longest time, you had different systems existing on these shores. You know, China talks about one country, two systems. Well, the United States beat them to the punch, although fortunately it's not the kind of system that I'm about to describe in the United States. For example, there was dispossession of the indigenous, genocide against the indigenous, enslavement of the Africans, and a kind of bourgeois democracy for the settlers. And after formidable struggle and shedding of blood, and also assistance from the international community, we were able to move away, we thought, from that system. And we thought what we were moving towards was bourgeois democracy across the board. But in light of book bannings, in light of the death penalty, in light of the crisis of masculinity as captured and encapsulated by the attacks on women's reproductive freedom, what we might be enduring in this country, instead of having those formerly subjected to genocide and enslavement being integrated into bourgeois democracy, you might have the opposite. That is to say, the whole country moving towards what once only befell those of us who did not happen to be settlers. And even if you look at the rise of US apartheid post 1865, post the end of the US Civil War, one of the things you'll notice is that settlers who were unsympathetic to genocide against the indigenous or apartheid inflicted on what used to be called the Negroes, they could be lynched too. They could be liquidated too. They could be run out of town. And so they were being subjected to the kinds of pulverizing and penalties that we thought was the province of those of us who were not settlers. And so this is a very ominous turn of events, I assure you. If the United States decides, in its collective lack of wisdom, to, instead of moving to integrate many of us into bourgeois democracy, it moves in the opposite direction.